The title I chose for this lecture today is Darwinism and Evolution, because Darwin didn't start the idea of evolution. Evolution was there before Darwin, despite the fact that he was the most famous for it. Darwinism, that means the theory of evolution that Darwin proposed, wasn't such a perfect theory, and so there are gaps that I'll be mentioning later on. And then evolution, as we know today, is different from what Darwin suggested in those days. Now, one has to understand, or one has to be exposed really to what sort of puzzles or mysteries naturalists had to deal with in the 19th century. Fossils were one of them, because fossils were found everywhere. These are creatures that appear in the rock, and people were wondering what they could be. And there, at that time and before various explanations, some people called them just jokes of nature. They called them Satan's false sign to lure us from faith, to make us doubt creation and so on. And it's God test of our faith, as some would put it. And some suggested mythical explanations, that they were just remains of mythical organisms, dragons or serpents. And some put some religious connotation to this, and probably they were monsters that were turned into stone by supernatural powers, by saints, and so on. And there were people who were saying that these were creatures that existed before and went extinct. And that's what we know today. But at that time, extinct creatures was not something acceptable by people, because people believed that creation started a few thousand years ago and nothing could go extinct. The other puzzle or mystery was, why was there so much variation and diversity? And everywhere you go on the globe, you will see different sort of creatures. So first, why so many different species exist on Earth? And why within the same kind you have so much variation? You rarely find identical twins amongst them. They're all different. There's a lot of variation. And obviously, there was a question that was raised by the previous question, saying whether any species exists in a fixed form, or do species change over time? And when we say extinct species, that means maybe some species went extinct, some species didn't, and they changed over time. Now, Charles Darwin comes to this backdrop, and he's born to an English middle class with good income. His father was a successful and respected physician, and he followed in his father's footsteps, as his father will probably prefer, so he joined medical school at Edinburgh. He didn't last long there, so he dropped out. And there could be a number of reasons that historians talk about, but in 1827, he went, ironically, now we think of it, to study theology. And that meant that he would destined to become a minister in the Church of England. And on the whole, he wasn't such a brilliant student as far as the academic institutions could tell. And his father was quite disappointed with his performance. And one day he wrote to him, "You care for nothing but shooting, dogs, and rat catching, and you will be a disgrace to yourself and all your family." Now, in 1831, he got this opportunity with a bit of help from connections, Wasta, his uncle, and his professors. They recommended him to go on a voyage by the Beagle, the ship that was making a trip around the globe, making studies of geology and organisms, living things, plants, animals, and so on. And they recommended him to go on that voyage, and he did. So in 1831, they sailed, and first land where he landed was in Brazil. And the Brazilian Amazonian forest impresses anyone even today. And so he was really impressed with the huge diversity that you find there. He collected various sort of animals from there and plants. And while on trip, when they're going around South America, there was groups of people there, populations of the local so-called Indians, who were living under very harsh conditions, very cold conditions there, barely dressed. And so he was impressed with their ability to survive under these conditions. And in Chile, he experienced an earthquake, which changed the level of the land something like 2 meters. So he was able to witness how dramatic changes on Earth could occur, knowing that Darwin, when he set off, he was actually a naturalist. So he was also interested in geology, not only in natural, and not only in living things. And one of the most notable experiences was in the islands of the Galapagos, an archipelago there, where he was able to see a variety of organisms there that he was never able to see anywhere else. Actually, they don't exist anywhere else. Now, these were uninhabited volcanic islands, and they were inhabited only by a set of very strange organisms, some birds that cannot fly anymore, these giant tortoises, birds that were also very odd, having been there. He was actually able to see that in the archipelago, he was able to see different islands populated by different sort of species, slightly different from the ones in the next island. And there was a story there about their evolution, so to speak. But obviously at that time, he was, remember, only in his 20s. And so he was still without the experience that you will find actually in more experienced scholars. But he actually was a very meticulous observer, and he noted everything. Here we could see him measuring the speed of the giant tortoises. The one he's measuring the speed of was the male. He wanted to see what's the speed of the male chasing a female. So that much detail went into his notes. Now, at that point, with little experience, but still he was thinking about all sorts of theories to explain some of the phenomena he saw in those islands. He wrote in his diaries later, "I felt myself brought within reach of that great fact, that mystery of mysteries," what he meant was the mystery of the origin of species, which would actually be the name of his book. Now, for many years, he was publishing other sort of material, and he was discussing the ideas that he had about evolution with his close friends. And in 1858, he had to do something about it, because someone who was a well-off person, not very rich, not in the same material wealth that he had, that was Alfred Russel Wallace, who was actually working in the Far East, and he sent Charles Darwin a manuscript for a paper that he intended to publish, and that paper talked about evolution along the same lines that Darwin was thinking about, and that was evolution by natural selection. So he had to do something about it, and so discussing this with his friends who knew the way that he was actually thinking about his theory, and so they suggested to present the two ideas there in two papers in a meeting of the Linnaean Society in London. And the concept that both were suggesting, Darwin and Wallace, was evolution by natural selection. Now, we know Darwin more than Wallace, because Darwin eventually produced material there that was based on a lot of examples, a lot of knowledge, and but Wallace and Darwin are known for this idea of natural selection. In 1859, he decided to publish more of his ideas, and so he published the book that he's well known for, The Origin of Species. And the title was The Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. Now, the book that he was worried about that is not going to sell eventually was a bestseller. It was actually sold out in one day. And in the whole book, the word evolution wasn't mentioned. He mentioned the verb evolve in the last paragraph in his book, but he preferred to use something that reflected his view of how evolution occurs, and that was descent with modification. But in his sixth edition, he used the word evolution because it was too hard to avoid using it in those days. Now, what we call Darwinism today is not wholly based on Darwinian theory, because there were three of the concepts I'll be mentioning now that were there before him. And his was the mechanism. The others before him couldn't propose a mechanism. So the first idea there that species are not constant, and they change over time. Now, this was not totally a new idea, because other people in the past, as far away as the Greeks and the Romans, they suggested that all living things were related and they had changed over time. Like Anaximander and Lucretius suggested this idea. Now, it is also known, but not relevant to Darwin, but it is known that in the 12th century, there were, even as far away as 8th century, there were some Muslim scholars like Al-Jahiz, and then in the 10th century, Muhammad al-Nakhshabi, and then Nasr ad-Din Tusi in the 13th century, who talked about a number of things that were actually the theme of which was that organisms are facing all the time a struggle for existence, and that struggle will make them change over time. Now, obviously, no mention of mechanism there. And then in the 19th century, Lamarck suggested his theory of evolution that I'll be talking about later on. The other idea that was important was actually the concept that evolution goes very slowly and gradually. Now, when people were talking about the change in organisms, they had, so to speak, limited time to play with, because they didn't think that the Earth was so old. And so Buffon and Cuvier suggested an idea of catastrophism. That means every now and then you get a global catastrophe of some sort, and then all organisms go extinct, and that's what explains the fossils. And then these successive geological catastrophes eventually will lead to, after each one, you get some new organisms emerging. And they suggested that the Earth must be, for them, very old, like 70,000 years old. Now, that was not long enough for the other ideas there. Now, the creationists faced with these ideas of catastrophism suggested that maybe our creation nowadays is the latest creation, because before that, there were many creations before, and they went extinct. And then there was another creation, and so on. Now, this idea doesn't fall with the idea of gradualism, because the other concept there that was suggested by Hutton in the 18th century, and later on in the 19th century by Lyell, Charles Lyell. Now, Lyell produced a book, The Principles of Geology, which Darwin had with him on his voyage. And he was actually impressed with some of the ideas there, but eventually he had to accept some of the ideas that geologists suggested there, which was what we call uniformitarianism. What uniformitarianism says simply is that if you want to look for what happened 10,000 years ago or 1 million years ago or whatever, you don't have to think of phenomena occurring at that time that are different from phenomena that occur today. So geological events could be explained by little forces, and these little forces we see every day, every year. We see the same forces in action. So the same force in the present and the past, which means that the processes that are occurring there are uniform from generation to generation, from epoch to epoch, and so on. And so we could just tell what happened in the past by looking and describing what's happening today. For example, uniformitarianism, if one looks at the rock formations and the various strata or layers you find on rocks and the shapes and so on, you can explain them by the fact that these occurred not in one go, like in one catastrophe or in one event. They were actually occurring in simple processes of erosion and deposition. For example, we know that rivers keep bringing sediments, and now we know that when it rains in Beirut, the streets become full of sediments every year, and they clean them up. If you don't clean them up, then the city will become buried like many ancient cities in the past. And so this will bring more and more sediments to cover an area. And wind also blows in some areas and brings a lot of dust and sand and so on. And then these, over time, they will metamorphose or change into rocks. But in order for this to happen, we need millions of years. You can't explain that something last year was in the form of mud, the next year it was a rock. It would take millions of years before these actually change into. Now, one simple example of uniformitarianism is the formation we find, for example, in Jaita and similar grottos. These are rock formations that you see there. Now, the way they're formed is drop by drop. If you go there, you can watch it. You can see the drops coming down every second or so. And then eventually these build up into these formations. Now, in this case, it takes several thousand years, but some other formations, major ones, require tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, and millions, and tens and hundreds of millions of years before they form. So uniformitarianism means that something is happening today will tell us what has been happening for the last thousands of years, and that's all you need to explain these formations. So the main implication of this theory is that the process is gradual. And that means in order for all of these phenomena to happen, you will need an Earth that is really very, very old. And you cannot explain this in terms of thousands of years. You have to explain in terms of millions of years. Now, the first one to adopt this idea in biology was Lamarck. Now, Lamarck put this idea of uniformitarianism to the evolution of organisms, that organisms, when they change from one form to another, that doesn't happen over years or maybe hundreds of years. It actually occurs over many, many, many years. For that change to happen, it has to be very gradual and very slow. And that is one of the contributions of Lamarck to the idea of evolution, because he's remembered for something not that good, really, because he suggested mechanisms that were not really plausible. Now, the third concept there is the branching. That means that organisms are there. We have different sort of species, and all these species should be related somehow, because the previous concept were that we can classify these organisms and we put them in a hierarchy, like, for example, Aristotle suggested, which was eventually adopted by the Christian theology, that you have inanimate matter at the lower end of the ladder, and then you have more advanced ones and more advanced ones, and so you go all the way up to humans being the most advanced among these. So this goes from the most imperfect to the most perfect. But Christian theology suggested that you have to go further, and so what could be more perfect than humans is angels, archangels, and eventually, ultimately, it's God who is the perfect being. Now, this was actually demolished by the idea of uniformitarianism and branching and the long time it takes for species to branch into each other. The fact that something is advanced, something is not advanced is also not a plausible one. Now, what Darwin suggested, and before that, obviously, the other naturalists who suggested this, that there's some relationship, and then you can actually relate, not classify organisms, you can relate them. You can classify them by relating them to each other. And one important thing that Darwin stated was that why are two organisms similar? Because they are related. Not because just happen to be similar. They are related. And when we say related in human terms, means that your brothers and sisters look similar because they come from the same parents. You in a family, extended family, you have similarities. In a nation, you're similar because you are related. And so that meant, if you want to translate this into living things, that means different species are related. In the same way that brothers have a common ancestor, species also have common ancestors, and you can relate them in this way. Now, some of these things that Darwin was scribbling about the relationship between organisms, people are still working on this today. In various groups, they're still working out the relationship between the different species. Now, the main thing that Darwin was particularly Darwinian was the theory about the mechanism of evolution, and that is the natural selection. Now, it was influenced by a number of things happening at that time, and Thomas Malthus was one of those people who was not actually a naturalist, he was an economist, and he wrote an essay on the population and the principle of population. What he meant was human population. And what he suggested was that human populations grow with time, and as they grow, sometimes they might actually grow geometrically or exponentially, while resources grow linearly. And at some point, the resources become too little for the population, and that's when the population faces conflict, faces a problem, a crisis. And so the crisis means that not all individuals in the population are able to cope, are able to get their resources in an equal manner. And so some people do better than others. If not, then people might actually have war on each other. Nations fight each other over resources. And so that leads to the food shortages, famine, diseases, wars, etc. So Darwin said if this is happening in humans, obviously it might also happen in various other creatures, knowing that many of them actually produce even more offspring than humans do. It was influenced by a process that humans have been practicing since the beginning, and that was actually artificial selection. Now, the domestic dog that we have today has been bred over many, many generations to make it more peaceful, more human-friendly, and so on, which is not the case that you find for the ancestor, which was a wolf-like ancestor. Now, we know that we could also select even more and produce all sorts of breeds of dog. These are just some of the breeds, but we know that there are probably hundreds of breeds of dogs, all of them produced from the same species, so to speak, just by making selections. That means, in this case, the selection is for a desirable trait. Like, for example, what he played with for some time, Darwin dealt with some pigeon breeding, chicken breeding, and so on. And also we know that there are so many breeds of chicken, so many breeds of pigeons. And an adaptation that one is talking about is not the environmental or ecological adaptation we talk about organisms, but we say that what is desirable in this case is what we select for. So we only breed the ones with the right character. We breed cattle that bring us a lot of milk or bring us a lot of meat and so on. And so whatever desirable characteristics that we might actually call adaptations, we can translate this into adaptations in nature, where nature selects, in this case, for the right adaptation. The ones that have the right adaptation will be the ones that survive, and the ones that don't have will be extinct. Now, artificial selection or selective breeding has been practiced on all sorts of organisms. Many of the staple foods that we have today have come through artificial selection. Otherwise, the natural population do not have the same characteristics like wheat or corn or anything of this sort. Now, Lamarckian evolution that was suggested, which had the right premises there regarding gradualism, it didn't actually, or Darwin didn't produce a good explanation. Lamarck didn't produce a good explanation. He didn't suggest a mechanism, or the mechanism he suggested was not very plausible. So Lamarck suggested that maybe there's some determinism there, that evolution leads to similar ends all the time. So we're bound to have humans eventually in Earth. So evolution is a goal-oriented process, which now we don't accept as being a right way of looking at living things. Species do not go extinct, according to Lamarck, which we know that many species actually have gone extinct. But they changed in different species, as Lamarck suggested. And the worst theory that he had was easier to demolish, really, which was that characteristics transfer from one generation to the next generation by being used more often, by being more useful, if you like. And so things that are useful then will eventually be inherited by the offspring. And so it's like, I mean, you would tell that this is not a theory that could be accepted, because it's like saying, well, if you go and spend a lot of time in the sun and get a tan, that means your babies will have the same sort of color, which is not. Or if you go to the gym and exercise, then you have big muscles, and that means the children will have big muscles. So that wasn't obviously something that didn't take long before this was demolished. Now, to give this idea about what Darwin suggested, that in all the population of anything like the giraffe got its long neck because at some point in the giraffe's past, the giraffe was faced with a situation where it was a good idea to be able to reach branches. And so all the individuals are able to reach, let's say, higher branches. So the one, eventually, they will stretch, and then eventually, as they stretch their necks, their offspring will have also necks that are stretched. But also remember that we're talking about something that occurs very gradually. So Lamarck suggested that even a slight stretch, like 1 millimeter in every generation, then will translate over many years into many centimeters and so on. So all the population actually goes through a process of evolution, which is not the way that natural selection suggests. Because Darwinian natural selection will suggest that the population is composed of various individuals, and there's a lot of variation within any population. The problem is that what Darwin didn't know where the variation came from. Now we know that these come from mutations. Genes mutate, and so you have different genes, and so you have different characteristics in different individuals. Now we know that this is the case, but at the time Darwin couldn't answer many of the questions related to where variation came from, but variation exists. And amongst the variants in the population, you might have some that have longer neck, slightly longer neck than others, and they will do better than others. If they do better than others, that means they will survive better, and they will leave more offspring in the next generation. And that, as you go many, many generations, eventually the ones that will survive better are the ones that are going to be there after, let's say, 75 generations. And the other ones that did not match the ability of the others by having shorter necks will disappear. And so, in a way, after a period of time, some individuals will breed to the extent that they themselves, their offspring, will dominate the population, and the population will be composed of giraffes that have long necks. And that's how natural selection occurs. Fine, so one of the things that happened after this was that Darwin wasn't in good health, and he was actually staying at home very often. And so many people went out and started really defending his theory. One of them was Thomas Huxley. He was known as Darwin's bulldog because he was the one going out advocating the idea of evolution. Now, he was actually upset because he thought that, well, I should have thought of this. And there are actually quite a number of naturalists who thought that it's such a simple idea, and how extremely stupid not to have thought of it. But he wrote in support, and he wrote on human evolution that others didn't write. Darwin didn't even write on human evolution. And there are a number of things that we eventually, he was responsible for, like the term Darwinism. He was talking about Darwinism, and people were criticizing this as if it's a new religion or something. And anyway, he also coined the word agnostic. Now, many of us know the word atheist, which means that you don't believe there's a God. Agnostic doesn't mean you don't believe there's a God, but it's irrelevant, or I'm not sure. Agnostic, I don't know. Maybe there is, maybe there isn't, but that's not really what matters. So the word agnostic is for anyone who doesn't necessarily believe in God, but, well, he might be there, or there could be some reason to believe in him and so on, but it's not atheism. Now, Darwin's books, later on, he wrote many books, a couple of which talked about the descent of man, about human evolution, especially in terms of behavior, and in relation to sex, emotion, and so on. And there was a major gap in Darwin's theory, and that was that no explanation of inheritance. He could say that offspring inherit their ancestors' traits, but he couldn't tell how this happens. And the mechanism of inheritance took a generation before people learned about it, because somebody was sitting there in his monastery doing experiments, but they went unnoticed. and that was about the time of Darwin. And so in the 1900s, they were actually discovered, and then they actually stimulated a lot of research in this issue. And so the science of genetics was born. And genetics in all its forms, whether it's Mendelian genetics or molecular genetics, or whatever, but actually in terms of its relation to evolution, it was the single most important contribution to the theory of evolution at that time. And so early in the century, as genetics developed, then people were incorporating it more into the idea of evolution, and many scholars at that time, they developed what we know today as being the new synthesis of evolutionary theory. Actually, the idea of, or the concepts in genetics and mechanisms there reinforced Darwinism. We don't call it Darwinism today. We're just talking about being the new Darwinism. But the basic ideas there of Darwin, natural selection, and so on, they work. Not only this, genetics explain them even better than Darwin could explain them. So there was a theory, and then it was supposed to explain things. So what does evolution theory explain? Actually, one has to emphasize at this point that there's no other theory that explains all the things that I'm going to mention. There's no other theory whatsoever. It keeps evolving, so to speak, but it develops. You have more additions, you have more people getting involved, raising questions and so on, but still, evolutionary theory, as we know today as biologists, there's no better explanation. So first, it explains fossils, because fossils were one of the puzzles that were puzzling people at that time. So it shows that over time, some species change, some species go extinct, and we can actually trace the changes in the fossils. And so the ones in the fossils that are at the bottom of the sediments are the older ones, and the ones that are more recent tend to be on the surface. And so you can actually see the sequence of evolution there with the fossils. Now, we can tell more complete stories, for example, like the evolution of the horse. The horse started as being a small animal, and then it evolved to become the horse that you know today. And we could see fossils that will tell us the story, complete story. We can actually see them in sequence, and we can date them, and we can tell this one came before the other one, and so on, until we have the horse that we have today. Now, some people might say, well, how could such a small animal become a horse eventually, the horse that we know? Well, very often take simple example there. If you actually look at these two species there, you would say that, well, they might be, they might not be. But in order to see that they are really related and one of them has evolved from the other, when you see the intermediates, and there are plenty of intermediates there that show how small changes eventually translate into big changes over time. Biogeography is another field which involves looking at the geographical distribution of organisms. Now, if you look at the evolution, if you look at human populations, geographically, you will find that humans that are close by geographically tend to be similar than ones that are distant geographically, because they are related. They're related because they come from some common ancestors. Now, you don't have in nature, obviously, because nowadays people migrate to different places, but generally, nations are similar because they have common descent. And if we look at species, if we examine their relationship, we see that the most related ones are the ones that are found in close-by geographic regions, which meant that there was some common ancestor that led to different species, and they're still around because they just dispersed into other areas. We can see this in many situations. You don't find a species in Lebanon, for example, related to a species in Washington, because geographically it's too far for species to disperse, and so we find related species in the nearby areas. Comparative anatomy shows us a number of things that show similarities there that might have changed also over time. So take the human hand, you have you have homologous structures there that show that they have common ancestry. The structure of the limb itself is the same. You have changes, different changes in some of the parts that are found in these. Ranging from humans to birds, you find the same components there that have evolved. Now, some of them might actually disappear, some of them remain, and vestigial structures are structures that still show in some animals despite the fact that really they have lost the use for them. Like the whale, for example, they have limbs there that are hidden there. They're not used anymore. So they have, over time, they've become less and less useful, and so evolution led to their minimization. And we see this in, for example, snakes that have become limbless because they lost the need for limbs because their burrowing lifestyle doesn't need it. Like, take, for example, this lizard, this Lebanese lizard. People think it's a snake, unfortunately, and because they think it's a snake, you know, the first reaction is to smash it into pieces, you know. There's a small limb there because the limb has also, in a way, disappeared. And that is similar to the way that it has disappeared in snakes. Humans have a number of vestigial organs there, from the wisdom tooth to the muscles of the ear to the hair and the underlying structures there of the hair, like the muscles that change the hair position and so on, which are not needed anymore in humans, but it's still there. And you have some muscles there in the belly that, you know, you have the vermiform appendix. We know how many people often have an operation to remove it because it used to be in ancestral species a big structure there called the cecum that some animals use. Take this one, which is known as Darwin's tubercle. And there's a pointed part of the ear. By the way, it's not found in all humans, but it doesn't mean that humans haven't descended from apes. But this actually is the vestigial remains of a pointed ear that still remains there. When you look at embryos, if you look at the embryos, the earlier we look at the stages of embryos, we find that they're more and more similar. As they develop into fetuses and then as offspring, they might become different. But as they go back, obviously as we go back, we find that in all animals there's a sperm and an egg, and that's just the way reproduction happens. And that's how. Now, we know that at the molecular level and the biochemical level, we know that we share all the mechanisms that we have. Like, we have nucleotides, proteins, lipids, we have enzymes that do the same thing in the same way in all organisms. We have the DNA translated into proteins in the same way in all organisms. Obviously, you might have different proteins, but the mechanism is the same. You can actually transplant, so to speak, a segment of DNA, put it in another organism, it will function. And it could produce material there that would be desirable to produce for any purpose, like commercial purpose. Organisms evolve to adapt, and so we have adaptations of all sorts of animals, like mammals are found in different sorts of habitats. You have marine mammals, you have desert mammals, you have mammals in various burrowing mammals, and so on. And birds have different beaks for different purposes. So these are adaptations that evolve with time for coping with the challenges of nature. Now, some people say, but we cannot see evolution happening. Of course we can see it happening. We can't see species appearing because species will take longer, but we can see evolution in action. We know that in hospitals, people might actually catch a bacterium that might give them trouble because some of these bacteria have become exposed to so much antibiotic. Natural selection would really favor the bacteria that are not killed anymore by the antibiotics. And so we see evolved bacteria. We find the same phenomena in insects when they use pesticides. So insects eventually become resistant to the pesticide because the natural selection, or the selective force in this case, is the pesticide, in the same way that the selective force is the antibiotic. We know today many organisms become adapted to pollution. Also, over time, natural selection would favor the ones that are able to survive under these conditions. Now, many of the people who criticize evolution, they say, but how could such a thing appear without a designer? And the idea of design without a designer is something that you could actually see in so many different organisms. If you just follow the steps of evolution, for example, like the eye, you could see various species of animals that have some light-sensitive pigment. You could see a slightly more advanced form, and eventually you might find an eye, a full eye. Like some people say, how could a full eye appear in just one go? It doesn't. It takes a long time. And it doesn't need a designer because nature designed it. Natural selection designed it. Now, let's take something in humans, like languages. Languages are cited as good examples of how something could actually evolve without design. So nobody could claim that any language has been designed by anyone. We know that languages evolve over time, and languages, you might actually have a grammar to structure a language that is probably designed by somebody, but the language has appeared in many different sort of populations, and you might actually find something similar to what you find in biogeography. So close by populations speak similar languages. The ones that speak different languages, usually they're very far. And so we can actually trace ancestry of languages. We can trace ancestry, we can have groups of languages in the world that eventually have a geographic distribution, which shows how languages could actually evolve. In the same way, as you can see, like the fish in the Amazon that have evolved over time, languages evolve over time, and they have similar phenomena. You have similar faults that you might actually find in organisms, and the imperfections that you get in organisms, but they evolve without a designer. So obviously you expect people to have hostility to Darwin, especially when it comes to human evolution, because people may accept that this worm has evolved from the other worm, but to say that humans have evolved from something else, that was a difficult thing, because other creatures do not have a soul. We have a mortal soul that will. And we couldn't have evolved from apes, because that was too much to accept, even today, for some people. But in reality, we know that Darwin was very bold to suggest that humans might have evolved from other animals in the same way that any animal evolves by the same mechanisms. When you realize that Darwin was so bold, because at that time there was only one known non-human species, or so to speak, human species, other than the living humans, and that was the Neanderthal. Neanderthal man was the only species of human-like creatures that existed then. But since then, there are thousands and thousands of discoveries. He predicted that one day light will be thrown on the origin of man in the history. And that's what happened over the 20th century until today. We keep finding new things about them. Now, the red circle there shows the position of the human Homo sapiens amongst the other different sorts of species. We can trace them back to something like 7 million years. So the latest ones, there are always some. Latest one was Homo naledi, which was found in South Africa. And there are some recent Chinese discoveries. They don't change the idea about human evolution, the whole concept. They change some details in the story of how did this happen. And for example, the idea is that all humans have evolved from some African origin. The Chinese discovery suggests that probably they evolved independently there than humans elsewhere. And other people bring other stories or other changes to the story, but the concept remains the same. Evolution of behavior. Behavior evolves because it's determined by genes. And genes are inherited, and so behavior is also inherited. For example, taking the ants and the bees, we can relate these by DNA, and we can see also that they have relationships in their behavior. They're very close when their DNA is close, or they're distant when their DNA is distant. Now, human behavior, people don't want to think about human behavior as something that has evolved, but it actually has evolved. We see many features in humans, for example, in the mate choice, how you choose the girl or how the girl chooses the man. There are a number of parallels that you find in animals. Social behavior is one aspect that is important for the evolution of humans because it actually shaped human evolution. And so there are some unique features there in humans that made them, for example, able to disperse widely, and so that's why they dispersed all over the world, and they went to places that you wouldn't dream of with earlier human species. Now, take body language, a smile, which is always a puzzle. How does a smile, why is it that a smile makes such an impact on people? Because it emerges from our ancestry, a chimp-like ape that when a chimpanzee nowadays, we know that when it goes to face another chimpanzee and then it doesn't want to make any trouble, it will bare its teeth in this way. And so it's like saying to the others, look, I don't mean any trouble. And so that is a sign of appeasement or pacification or something like this. So we evolved the smile, and we can see a number of smiling monkeys there. Now, this is an illustration from one of Darwin's books about a baboon showing such a smile by just being scratched on the back, enjoying the scratch on the back, so it shows this as a sign of pleasure. Now, the question of ethics in human behavior is another issue that people worry about, say. If we think about ourselves as animals and then we go around exercising natural selection in a way that nature does, but we do it ourselves, that actually led to something that was called at some point social Darwinism, which meant that, okay, if this is the way nature happens, let's accelerate it. And so they practiced a number of things there of selection, artificial selection on humans. And that led to many fascist ideas in Europe at that time. And so the idea that evolution conflicts with ethics is unbased on any science. And the implications that, yes, okay, struggle for existence, that means let's be selfish and just look out after ourselves. Now, this was not accepted, and eventually it faded away, because ethics has a biological basis. Ethics is needed for our evolution. Human evolution is led to social structures, social groups that could only function with some code, some ethical code. And that is, ethics is a biological need, not just simply taught by religion or one. We can see this happening in many related species. We can see it happening in even less intelligent species like ants and bees. They behave socially. They have some ethic there, behaving with each other, that could come biologically, not by teachings or sermons. So what is the impact of evolutionary theory? First, it has become the organizing principle in biology. One of the scholars, late scholars, who was convinced that evolution explains everything, he suggests that nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. Evolutionary biology is an important branch in biology today, which explains variability and changeability. There's a modern Darwinian zeitgeist. In Europe and America, there are quite a number of people who don't believe in the told stories in religion. So this science, biology as a science, and Darwinism or evolutionary thought has important impacts on human thought. Today's human thought is widely influenced by Charles Darwin. Now, refuting teleology, which means, like Lamarck said, that we're bound to go, evolution goes in a certain direction, it doesn't. It could be random, it could be chance, and so on. Final cause isn't what drives evolution. What drives evolution is natural selection, and that could turn one way or another. Typology, which actually means that a cat is a cat, and all things that look similar are cats, and you might actually think of different sort of cats that might include the tigers and the lions and so on. Now, this is typology, but evolution would suggest that each one of these is a different species and has different challenges, and so they evolve to cope with different environmental problems. A new of humanity, like also some people suggest maybe that evolution makes humans just like any animal. But in fact, evolutionary theory shows how unique humans are. And we know that it doesn't change the status of humans as being unique, a unique species on Earth. The problem is rejecting supernatural causation. That's one implication there. And so that actually would put evolution at odds with religion, all sorts of religion. And so at that time, it produced many problems with Christian theology. And nowadays, even in the United States today, you have many groups who think of evolution as the root of all evil, and many pressures were made not to teach evolution in schools and in universities. And there was something that they suggested to be an alternative, which is creationist science. Later on, they called it the science of intelligent design. And even here at home, we had some problems at some point at the time of Darwin. In 1882, Edwin Lewis was given the task of giving the commencement speech, and he talked about Darwin as an example of transformation of knowledge into science by long and careful examination. So now George Post, at that time the Protestant college was a missionary school, and so George Post was offended with this, and so he went against this. Some people sided with Lewis, like Van Dyke, and then there were various protests there. There were faculty resignations and the student strikes and so on. Now, eventually, we went through this nowadays. We've been teaching evolution for the last 25 years, and nobody is making any issue on this. So the idea that Darwin's father suggested that he was going to be a disgrace to himself and all his family, eventually Britain recognized Darwin as one of its important figures, and he was buried in the Westminster Abbey. But he died as an agnostic. Now, some people might still not agree with Darwin, and usually we think about people, but sometimes you don't know what the apes have in mind, so they might also not be happy with the theory at all. Thank you very much.